It also proves that you told us something, Nick, when we claimed you didn't.
Yes, very true.
Well, hello, Nick.
What I'm going to try to do is to start with this example FR form and just work our way through the tabs. And so if you have a question, stop me at any point and we can talk about it. Obviously, these numbers are going to be fake because Delta State is not in Arkansas, but it's the easiest way to work through this.
Hey, Vaughn. Okay, thanks.
See if I can get all of this working properly. Okay. So all we're going to talk about today are the fiscal request forms, which I guess are due tomorrow. So trying to answer as much of this as possible. So the first page workbook sheet of the workbook is the FR1, the appropriation summary. This is going to be an accumulation of data from the other tabs in the workbook for the most part. This top section should all have formulas that pull from other worksheets. So you don't need to manually type any numbers into this part. The parts that you will need to enter are here from line 35 down. And these are the numbers that we talk about. We check against your Series 17. The unrestricted balances of June 30th. And for the most part, we make sure that matches your Series 17, and then hopefully you don't have a negative balance at the bottom. Right. So for the most part, the rest of this is auto-populated, so you shouldn't have much to do on this.
Hey, I'm trying to.
Are there any questions on this page before we move on?
On your forms on this sheet, also on that top section where everything auto-populates, if there's the options under here for other and you don't use those, you can feel free to delete that information from that specific column, because we're going to go in and delete that anyway. So if you've got those others listed there and you aren't using them, go ahead and delete those lines.
I'll just pull one up from a prior year.
Okay.
See if we can show one. All right, you guys see that? See where it has other type appropriation name? This is where if you had to add another tab for an extra FR3 or FR4, whatever, that will pull, you would update that. But if you have these, don't delete the whole line, just delete that data to make it blank. Leave the line so that it keeps everything else formatted the same if you don't mind. All right, the next item is the FR2. Not everyone has this. Obviously, you don't have a non-formula entity. You don't have to fill this out. These are going to be based on your different categories, not line items. This one won't show the line items. This is what you have your expenditure categories on your non-formula request. The way it's broken out in that should match back to this for your actual from FY21, your budgeted for 22. And these numbers may not tie exactly back to what you have on your FR3 and FR4 because your non-formula may be merged into your main appropriation. So you don't have a separate appropriation for this.
Quick question, Nick.
Yes.
We don't put
our expenditure categories by regular salaries, personal service matching there. We do it by the,
You don't have to on that. For the FR3 from the state treasury and the FR4 for the cash is where you want to make sure the line items are. Think on the, like your non-formula requests.
yeah, normally, I think I do put them, but you're wrong.
Well, I'm a little confused. Sorry, Nick, this is Janine. I'm a little confused about that because previously I'd always used instruction, research, public service, et cetera. Except when I got the biennial request forms last year, that was already filled in as regular salaries, benefits matching, to match our appropriations. So
Sure.
last time I did these forms, I started doing it that way. So which way is it actually supposed to be?
So
now
like,
I've done it both ways.
just pulling up SAU Tech. Sorry, Gabe, that's the one I opened. For an example, on the non-formula, when you submit your request, you have it listed however, this one's instruction, institutional support, plan operations. Those aren't by the line items. So if that's the way you have it listed on your submission, that's what your non-formula, the FR2 will show up, should show up as well.
And if we've already done them using regular salaries, matching, et cetera, I assume that's going to be okay as well.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
As long as the numbers totaled to the same, how you want to present that one, I'm not as worried about that. And these on the non-formula on the FR2, if you have it listed by line item, yes, we'll check it against the actuals for that. On the other, as long as the total comes out to the actual expense. We don't have a way to break it down when we're checking it in something into what you have categorized as research or public service. If we were using Delta State as an example. So when we get into the line by line checking of the expenses is when we get to the FR3s and FR4 for sure. And then on the non-formula, your recommendation should be in that table A through D chart that we sent out. And this was based off of the requests that were sent during the regular session for year 1 and year 2. We entered the year 2 request as your recommendation. So if you don't have any changes on the non-formulas, if you did not have any changes from those, then we didn't require you to submit a new one for a non-formula entity. But that is where we got these numbers for the base and program enhancements, and the 2.5 continuing level is from the second year request from the regular session. Yes, Form B should look like the FR2. Or the FR2 should look like Form B, whatever. Just and this one is one where the expenses and the income should match still to 0. I know I've thrown everyone off with this having recommendations that don't balance to 0 anymore. But non-formulas still have that where it will fall out as an even number both on the expenses and income for the request and recommendation. Any other questions on the non-formula tab? right, we'll go on to the FR3, which is the one that's given everyone the most trouble, I know, because I changed this, 2 years ago, and it's thrown everyone off. But this is for your state treasury appropriation, where your state funding will show up. The actual column, your actual expenditures by line item, we really want this to reflect what was listed in ACES, the state accounting system, by line item. I know it may not be exactly the same as your closing books, but ACES is what the Bureau, the legislative analysts are going to check against. That's the system that we have to be able to check against. So that's the numbers we're going to be looking for when we're reviewing this on the actual expenses. For the revenues for 21, I think we sent out the general revenue chart, the state funding chart from 21. I know we ended up with all of that being funded, and there was the excess that carried over in 22. If you are showing that in your budgeted 22, you want to go ahead and show the full general revenue in 21 as well, with that category D funding showing at the bottom, falling out as excess funding. That way you're going to have the category D number here, and then it will show up as your prior year fund balance at the top in the budgeted column as your carryover amount. That way this number as excess matches the fund balance top for the next year.
Hey, Nick, this is Charlotte.
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time getting my fiscal year 21 excess to match what is my prior year. Have you found from anyone else any tricks or anything that maybe something I might be doing incorrectly?
I'm not sure.
So Charlotte, look at your general revenue trial balance for any expenses, like if you've included the surety bonds or some other miscellaneous expenses that they charge directly to your general revenue fund, but not to your appropriation. That's usually the difference.
Thank you.
Or if you're not including the 20 general revenue carryover that they also did release at the last day in your prior fund balance for 21. So this is what 2 years in a row they've done the same thing. They waited the last day to release full funding, and you weren't able to spend it in that current year. Yeah, there are a lot in the on that trial balance, little miscellaneous transfers in and out that DFA makes that you may not fall into the general revenue, ETF, or workforce funding category.
Hey, Nick,
Yes.
can the total appropriations line 13 and the total income line 21, can there be a variance or a difference in those two that's shown in 22?
As long as the line 21 is higher, yes.
Okay, and if that's the case, then you would have a negative number on 22, right?
Yes.
Should that number on 22 go up
To line 14 in the budgeted column.
even if it's negative?
If it's negative, then it would show as a positive number on line 14 for the prior year balance.
Is right now. Thank you very much.
Does that make sense?
Well, I just want to, yes, it does, but I'm just curious. What I heard was on actual 2021 column,
Yes.
prior year fund balance, I do have a balance, and at line 22, I have a negative balance because there's
Yeah,
excess funding. I guess what I'm saying is, does that, since it was a negative number, I didn't put anything in the budgeted 21, 22. Those two are not correlated in any way, are they? I'm talking about the second column, the budgeted 21, 22.
now it should, but if you have a negative number in line 22 for actual, that should mean you had a fund balance, right?
Right.
Because a positive number would mean you spent more than you had funding for if there was a positive number.
Right.
So when you move it to that budgeted prior year fund balance, that becomes a positive fund balance number. It's
Okay.
not a negative anymore.
And you're talking about for the budgeted 21, 22 column?
Yeah, so like, here, let me throw some like, so if you add and somehow $50,000 there, it shows up as a negative in line 22.
Right.
So that's excess funding. So then you would have a positive 50,000 in your fund balance.
Okay. All right. That's what I was getting to. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Nick,
And more
this
than
is-
likely that number here and in the fund balance should be that category D funding that was released and carried over into the new year.
Nick, this is Donna McMillan. I have a question on 22. You haven't gotten to that yet.
Sure.
Maybe I'm jumping, but ahead. But our one-time incentive funding
Yes.
would go in other state treasury,
Yes.
and it would also show a negative.
Well, now on the one-time incentive funding from productivity,
Yes.
no, that would still show as general revenue.
Okay.
Yeah, because it is part of the RSA.
When I add up my totals, that's not included in my, I don't think that's included in my base. It's minus, the base is minus incentive funding.
Yes, the base would have that incentive reduced, but when you're listing the funding for the year, you would include that.
So I'll just add it to my general revenue. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
when we calculate the new base for the next year's productivity, we do remove that incentive funding. But for the current year, it is all included as one number for general revenue.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Hey, Nick,
Yes,
I'm looking at our form and we had a small negative balance in line 22.
Okay.
But it was significantly less than what we're showing as a carryover from the prior year. Does that mean we've done something wrong in our expenditure side of this?
possibly not. I mean, it's possible. Do you have a prior year fund balance in 21 as well?
We did not have one showing on the report we submitted last year. I'm new, so.
Sure. And that's probably part of it, is we did have funds that carried over from 20 to 21 as well.
Okay,
So you're probably not off in having expenses that use that. I'm not sure how much yours would have been that was carried forward from 20 to 21.
I'll have to see if I can find that. Okay, thanks.
You bet.
Nick, just to confirm, I just want to make sure that we're right. Since I'm not with Dina, but I'm looking at the same form.
Yeah.
The actual from 2021, we should, if we received any prior year fund balance, it should reflect there as well. Okay.
Yes. Now, again, if you read the notes, we have the prior year fund balance is only the portion needed to balance the budget.
Yeah, I know. That's
You
why we
don't
didn't
have
take
to
it.
report it, but if you are going to report it, that's what we're looking for. Yeah, that if when you report it, and you're showing an excess, that number should be coming up here to the fund balance. It should be this kind of flowing through the chart, if that makes sense. A negative here would come to here, or a negative.
Yeah, the negative there goes to there, but that, like Dina says, it's not the same number as
What your D was.
right, as what the bucket D was.
you know, I know.
And that may
it's-
be, and I need to go back and look at what Jane Ann said earlier. We need to go back and review our general revenue number as well.
Yeah, and so I know that, you know, this releasing the money the last day and allowing for carry forward doesn't usually happen. So it's not really a standardized practice to have that show up on these forms. So that's not as easy to track back for prior years for what you did. I will say, before we do the budgeted column, let's go ahead and do the authorized appropriation. This should be what is in your Legislative Appropriation Act for your state treasury. Should match those by line item. And I want to say that first, because this budgeted column, the line item for each of those should not exceed what's in the authorized. You can't have a budgeted amount that's higher than what's authorized.
Nick,
Yes.
So I know we've always done it according to the act, but what if you went to Peter and actually requested supplemental appropriation? Should we add that to that column? Could we?
Yeah.
I mean,
You can, if you already have it authorized, you can add it. Just be sure that you footnote
what it was from?
yes.
Okay.
If it's different from your act footnote, that's why it's different.
I think it would be helpful for some of them because they're going to show more expenses potentially in some areas, depending on where they got the supplemental.
And I will note, you know, for 22, that appropriation for the carryover hasn't been added to anyone's yet. You know, we have that carryover. I'm going to send a request during the fiscal session for additional appropriation for everyone, but it's not approved yet, so it's not going to show up. So you will more than likely have some excess funding in 22's budget as well. But we can't show anything in the budgeted column that's higher than what you have in that authorized column. And we can't budget a line item that you don't have in the authorized column either.
Hey, Nick, this is Mandy.
Yes, ma'am.
So, yeah, which I've already turned money in, but my budgeted column F is going to equal column G for us. So
Okay.
at the bottom of F22, I'm going to have carryover because when you carry over previous year to this year, I still don't have enough appropriation.
Sure.
So I'm still going to have a balance in F22. Does that excess on F22, does it need to go to H14?
No, and the only reason for that is these recommendations and requests are based off of the productivity model.
Okay, all right.
And so it won't line up, and we're going to add that appropriation in the current year so you can spend that excess funding.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because you said it would flow and I thought, maybe I screwed that up. Thank you.
Sure, yes. I know this one is the most confusing with everything going on with it. I understand that completely.
Hey, Nick,
Yes,
just, I notice here that there are some bullet points, I suppose, at the bottom.
yes,
Says line 14, prior year book fund balance includes only the portion of fund balance needed to balance that fiscal year's budget. I guess you're saying that it's not uncommon or wrong necessarily to have an excess funding appropriation. What exactly does that mean with regard to that line 14? Only the amount necessary to balance that fiscal year's budget. Does that mean that 13 and 21 should be the same and you should only put in 14 what's necessary to make it a zero?
that's what we have done in the past, yes. And as I was saying, if you want to show it that way and continue that process, I'm not going to tell you that it is wrong. I was just saying, if we show that category D funding falling out here, be sure you show it the same as a fund balance for 22.
Nick,
Someone looking at that is going to ask why it didn't carry over.
Are there any ramifications, or it's going to be viewed in a negative light?
well, so it used to be, the reason that was put in there is because you didn't really want to show
Your whole
that you
fund
had, that you had fund balance in your treasury.
Yes.
Because like you couldn't spend it all, like it was too much for you. So
Yes,
that's
exactly.
why you were always trying to aim for 0 on those bottom lines.
Yes.
So are you saying that that's not the case anymore?
Well, I would, the reason I'm saying it's okay for this one is due to that this last year where they released the funding the last day and you didn't have the ability to spend it. You know, there's a different justification for that where you don't have the ability to spend the money in a year and it carries over and you just didn't spend the money, if that makes sense. There's a difference in the way to explain how that happens. When you're trying to tell a legislator why you didn't spend $150,000.
Are we supposed to tell them that, or how are they going to know this?
I would think they know that we weren't allowed to spend our money.
Yeah, this started last year because
Yeah.
this was, as far as I know, that's the first year this happened like this, where they released the funding so late in the year. And so there was no option but to carry it forward.
Yes.
And so, and then again, we ran the same situation. I don't know why in 21, because they had plenty of time. We could have dropped it down, sent a blank requisition, you got it. But for whatever the reason, we were forced to carry it forward. So they actually forced us to carry it forward.
Yes,
So they should be fully aware of that fact, I would think.
And you like you said, Rhonda, they should know, but should is the very key word there in that phrase.
Well, I think in this situation, it's easy to explain why it didn't get spent.
It is very easy in this situation, but like I said, it was put there in prior years for if someone listed, you know, $500,000 there. Well, we don't need to give you that $500,000 because you didn't spend it in a year, so we can reduce your funding.
If I'm understanding this, and listen, I don't want to cross any type of ethical line here, so please, everyone jump in. But it sounds to me like what I'm hearing is that if line 14, that's probably wouldn't be viewed favorably if line 22 is greater than line 14. Because that means you would have excess in addition to what was funded late. Am I correct on that?
That's what I'm hearing.
This is Kerry. I would say yes, but the issue is going to be is that they rolled over funds again this year, which is creating your excess this year. So in that case, I think you could have that number be different. Right, Nick?
Between what, E14 and E22?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, because from 19 to 20, they required you to carry over funding. And then from 21 or from 20 to 21, you had to carry over funding. And then from 21 to 22, they required you to carry over funding. And those numbers were different. Right. The amounts that were carried forward each year.
Yeah, I think my number is bigger this year than it was last year.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the categories, the way they divided the categories were different between the 2 years. So it's very odd years, the past couple of years dealing with this. Any other questions on that side of this form? All right, and now the one that throws the monkey wrench for everybody for what I did, the recommendation column. Okay. So your operating recommendation, the appropriation side, these line items, if you look at the operating recommendation chart that I sent you, just look at the 4-year side. I don't have a Delta State one. The appropriation should equal this number in the last column, the total recommendation. Column S. I think it should be the same column on everybody's, yes. That number should be what shows up here on line 13, column H. Whatever line item you need it on, you increase, decrease, add a line, add a number to a blank line if you don't have it, if you need that. But all of these together should total that to that number that's in the last column on the operating recommendation.
Plus any non-formula. So you'd have to make sure you pick up your non-formula too if you had a recommendation.
Yes, yeah. If
For
your
them.
non-formula is included in this treasury appropriation, you would need to include that as well. If you don't have a separate appropriation for that. As for the, okay, so that's the appropriation side of it. The funding, the income side, your EETF and workforce should be the same as what's in columns B and C for the FY22 amount. We use those amounts because we don't have a forecast for 23 yet. So it should match whatever those numbers are. Category B and C. And non-formula, again, if you had the non-formula in there. Then your general revenue, if you want to use the same chart, you would take what's in category P, your total funding recommendation, and subtract EETF and workforce. If you want to use the same chart. Otherwise, you can use the productivity funding recommendation chart and it's column M. That's your general revenue recommendation. That should go here on H15, on line 15. So this total income number is not going to match your total appropriation number. They will not equal, they will not balance to 0. The reason for that is this column right here on the operating recommendation. Column R, and this is the amount that should fall out on that formula. Your line 22 for your recommendation should be this number. That's in the 2% appropriation adjustment column. It won't be 0, it will be whatever that number is. The reason we started doing this a couple of years ago is to account for any of those changes in EETF and workforce. We make the recommendations for 23 based off of the 22 numbers of EETF and workforce. So if we set it right at your general revenue EETF and workforce numbers, your appropriation level there, if there's any change when that final forecast for 23 comes out, we have to go back and ask for more appropriation. If you have some other source of state revenue that comes in, there's a few of you that have small pieces that come in. If you have revenues that come in there, you don't have appropriation to spend it because it's not factored into this model. So that's why we've added this 2%, not a big amount, but it allows for fluctuations in that so that you don't have to come back in the middle of the year and ask for additional appropriation to spend. But it makes your fiscal recommendation chart look crazy because it doesn't balance to 0. Does that make sense? Any questions on that?
Hey, Nick, it's Jeremy at UCA. I just want to confirm, I think I'm just going to confirm exactly what you just said, but that number in the 2% column where you've got it on line 22, column H.
Yes.
There should be a difference there of that 2% amount.
Yes.
Okay. So like if the way you've got that set up on your Delta State, example, basically I would just need to pull that out of the general revenue line.
More than
most
likely, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so if it was UCA, it would have the 1261268.
Okay.
That's what should show up on line 22.
Thank
You'll
you.
have more appropriation than you have funding.
Hey, Nick, I don't have that form we were just looking at. Could you send that to me?
The operating recommendation,
Yeah, I've got the 2120. What I've got doesn't agree to this number. I'm showing something else on what I've got. So evidently I've got the wrong form.
okay, yes, I will send that back out to you.
Thank you.
No problem.
Hey, Nick, are you gonna send that out to everyone? Because
Yes, I can.
Please.
Yeah, I'll
do.
just send it back out to the whole CFO distribution list.
Thank you, sir.
Nick, I have mine, but I did not pull out 2% down on, you'll go back to FR 3.
Yes.
On line 22 there, under the institutional recommendations, you know, I included that in general revenue. Now I pulled out educational excellence and workforce. But I just included the 2% in the general revenue line, so it's 0 at the bottom on line 22.
Yeah, you'll need to reduce that general revenue number. So if you're looking at your productivity, your general revenue recommendation, you know, yours would be that 11,410.
Okay. Well,
So it'll be less by a little bit.
I've submitted it, but we can resubmit. It will be the first
Not
time.
a problem. Just letting you all know what we will be looking at when we start reviewing these.
Yeah.
It's easier if you did that to reduce the general revenue number for you than if you balance them to general revenue and we have to figure out which line item to add appropriation to.
Right. Gotcha.
Nick, am I correct in thinking for the non-formulas?
It will still balance to 0.
Yeah, and those lines are supposed to equal what we submitted on our non-formula operating requests, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's what my notes said. I just wanted to make sure.
Any other questions on the treasury appropriation? Right. Move on to the cash appropriation. This one is going to be fairly similar to the treasury, at least on the first 3 columns. Again, the actuals will compare that to the ACES expenses. The authorized will come from your act, and then budgeted should be what you have currently budgeted in the ACES system. And again, they should not exceed what's on your authorized column. And again, as Julie said, if you've already been to peer, something got additional appropriation, you can increase that authorized line. Just make sure you note that so we know where to check against that when it doesn't match your act. For the recommendation for this one, that's going to be whatever you're requesting your cash appropriations to be. We don't make a recommendation as a coordinating board for those line items. I would say, you know, if you're going to be making much of a change on the increase, be mindful of, you know, the past few years, what we've had to do with keeping our appropriations somewhat close to what our actual expenditures are.
Nick, is the 10% guideline still applicable pretty much?
I think what we said is try to keep it in that range, but obviously sometimes you're going to need to go over that for projects that you anticipate. And so if you're going over that, just be sure you have a planned description for what that project is.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
So you don't have to keep it under 10%. It's not required. I wouldn't just go increasing everything by 20 and 30 for the sake of wanting to increase.
Nick, with all the money out there for infrastructure expansion, I mean, we've always asked for quite a bit more than what we actually spend in anticipation of funding for big projects, like grants and things like that. So we
Sure.
always ask for 55 million, even though we only usually spend about 5. I mean,
I think the capital, at least the capital improvements line, is probably the easiest to justify such a bigger difference. Because like you said, the anticipated revenues, if they don't come in, you can't spend it. But you do hope for them, plan for them. Projects need to be able to move forward without coming back and asking for additional at the point, you know, if something happens to a building, you need to be able to move on that when you can.
As someone who has had the unfortunate experience of having to testify about cash appropriations, one thing that is difficult to explain is, if you look at line 4, the personal services matching, this Delta State University is only spending 1.7, yet, you know, they're still asking for 14 million. So that's a little bit more difficult to explain than, okay, I might get a grant or I might be building a building. So just be aware of those operating lines, that it doesn't make a lot of sense to have, you know, 20 times what you need. So those are the items that'll get you caught. The ones that won't get you caught are things like capital outlay or capital improvements or debt service. I don't say,
oh, go ahead.
I wouldn't cut yourself short, but just know that will be the lines that will draw the most questions.
Yes. Yeah, I'll say that the same on the income for your budgeted and recommended, you know, sales and services on this one for Delta State going from 1.2 to 30 million. You really expect that big of a growth, or the other going from 6 to 88. Just make sure that if you're going to have it there, that you have some documentation or something to explain how you got to those numbers for such a big jump.
Yeah, I would more likely put your excess into your federal cash fund in anticipation of grants or in other, rather than look at that sales and services number. That one's pretty hard to explain to as well. So, and you wouldn't have to justify where the federal cash is coming, because you would just say, well, we have several grant funds out or whatever. So.
And then for the bottom of this chart, the positions where we usually list on the cash one, we should be able to get that from the personal services forms. If the ones with changes, we have those submitted already, and the ones that didn't have changes, we have. I think we left the actual and budgeted on the last fiscal session. For those that didn't submit changes, we didn't put anything there. We just put the request and recommended in there. But I think we have everyone's personal services forms at this point to be able to complete that.
Good.
How closely do you anticipate this getting looked at in terms of positions? Because of some of the controversy recently around positions that were on books that weren't necessarily filled. So your authorized positions and your actual, and even your authorized, your budgeted, can be significantly different. You anticipate that getting a lot of attention this time?
I don't think so. During this fiscal session, we've already had some discussions with the bureau staff and legislative staff that we are going to take a look at this for the regular session. Try to make sure we have the right size positions for the institution, even if that is more authorized than filled. But we've already had discussion, and we were going to take a broader look at that during the regular session.
Senator Rice or Representative Wardlaw, he said, I think Wardlaw probably is more familiar with this, with all of it. So I was just touching base with him.
Sorry, Melissa. All right, are there any other questions on the cash appropriation? right, the FR5, this is for your auxiliary enterprises. This one does not have a recommendation column. This is just reporting your actuals from 2021 and your budgeted amounts for 21, 22. Just be sure when you're filling these out, if you have items in line 7 or line 10, that you put note what those are on the other categories. Is there anything else you need to point out on this, Sarah or Chandra? Any questions on this one? All right. The FR6 is your employment report, number of actual employees that you have for the year for 21. And then this number, it should tie back to the actual if we have information there. You had 116.38. This should be 16.38. Again, if you didn't submit a change, we didn't update that information on the personal services. So just make sure you have this number. Obviously, this one should match your total employees there. If you don't have anything, you can go ahead and put a 0. Would be helpful. It's just the 3 categories of white, black, other, and then male and female.
Just be sure you leave the formulas where there are formulas in this one.
Yes. Right. And then the last one is for minority contracts. This is to report minority contracts that were awarded over $50,000 for each contract. However, the lines that mention total, like total contracts awarded, total expenses on contracts awarded, those are all contracts. Not just minority contracts, not just 50, that's total. I was reading this earlier. I think this note here, the exceeding 50,000 probably needs to be removed. It's just total expenditures on all contracts awarded. Which is what the note says, the bottom. This is the total amount of contracts awarded in 21 at the top up here. Down here, it's the total amount of expenses on contracts. May not be the same contracts. The amount that were awarded, the amount expensed, and then any minority contracts that were over 50,000, report those here. The name of the business, the total contract amount, and what type of minority it is.
And on that one, if you don't have minority contracts, just either put NA here or tell us that you don't have any up front.
Yes. Right. Any other questions on all of that? Once those are completed, these again, they populate themselves at the front. So the other reports. Is that helpful for everybody as you're trying to wrap this up?
Yeah, this was very informative, Nick. I think it was a good idea.
Any other questions on it? So we did record this, so I don't know that I will put it online or if I will just send it to you all if we can get it to send. But we do have it recorded so we can reference back to it in the future. Right, if that's it, I will let you guys have your day back. I appreciate y'all getting on with this. And you can always reach out to us if you have any other questions. We're glad to help.
Thank you, Nick.
All right, appreciate all of you.